In this lecture, we're going to look at some examples of Emigre America. And by this, I mean people who have come to this country, to the United States, and have made a difference in the architectural culture here. And then for most of the second part of the lecture, we're going to look at mid-century modernism, a term that is given to the sort of burgeoning aesthetic and work ethic, too, that developed in the United States specifically, and most interesting, really emerges from Michigan and some of the other production-focused states. But before we look at mid-century modernism, we're going to go back to the skyscraper. Now, we've already looked at early skyscrapers. Think of the Chicago School, people like Louis Sullivan, form follows function. Well, now, with access to new building technologies like reinforced concrete and also steel frameworks for buildings, it meant that designers could seek a whole new approach to the plan of the interiors of buildings. The enormous strength of these new materials opened essentially new worlds for designers that were unheard of in buildings before. So what does this do? Well, first we have what we would call the typical international style high-rise. And these are some characteristics of this kind of structure. So a square or rectangular footprint, simple cubic extruded rectangular form, so you can think of it as that footprint just extruded, very orthogonal. The third point is windows run in broken horizontal rows forming a grid. So this is like the ribbon window, yet now writ large on a building. And all facade angles are typically at 90 degrees. So again, very, very boxy, very, very planar and orthogonal. Some examples of these types of buildings that we'd refer to as the international style skyscraper include the United States Secretariat, and that's in New York City, and you can see it here. You'll notice that the skyscraper component itself is placed within this kind of plinth base. You can see some more details in there of the lobby as well. When it was completed in 1952 along New York's East River, the United Nations building stood as a symbol of world humanitarianism. It's a beacon of unity after the Second World War. And more than 50 years on, well, gosh, now it's like 60 years on, the 39-story building is regarded as one of the pinnacles of mid-century modernism in skyscraper form. Its magnificent public spaces and assembly halls, as well as its impressive collection of art by Chagall, Henry Moore, and many others, makes it one of the most visited tourist sites in New York. The architectural historian Louis Mumford spoke of the United Nations building and said, quote, "No one had ever conceived of a building a mirror on this scale before, and perhaps no one could guess what an endless series of pictures that mirror would reveal." Another example of the international style, not surprisingly, comes from Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Of course, he was an immigrant to this country. He's one of our sort of emigre designers who changed the way architecture looked and was considered in this country. Now, the building we're looking at here, 860 Lakeshore Drive, these are apartment buildings. These were built between 1949 and 1951, and they are two iconic skyscrapers along the Chicago skyline. And where the United Nations building redefined kind of the office tower, this one really redefined high-rise living for the post-war generation. The 26-story towers border Lake Michigan, and they give residents a beautiful waterfront view. So site is important. Mies's reasons for the scheme involved his concept that architecture should be independent of the site. Yet here, of course, they do consider the water. The towers do follow this rule, and we also see the industrialization of architectural form. So Mies approached the triangular site by arranging the two apartment buildings at cross axes towards one another, allowing views of the lakes for more of the apartment units. The 90-degree angle the buildings are situated also enclosed a plaza at the ground level, which you can see quite well here in this image. This is right on the plaza. Mies's concept of independent architecture is also seen in the rise of the ground floor. It makes the towers appear as though they are floating above the ground. So this is like Le Corbusier's pilotis. On the entrance level, a horizontal roof is the sole connector between the two high-rise apartment towers and does not have any function other than to, quote, mark the spirituality of this specific place, unquote. The plan for the towers was organized in a 21-foot grid that was represented with steel columns placed at the intersections. By using this grid for the structure, Mies simplified the steel frame to its purpose while also using it to express that sort of consistent modularity. Now, you'll remember from earlier lectures that Mies, of course, promoted skeletal architecture, or skin and bones. And because of this, Mies wanted that inner character of the steel skeletons to show, right, that skin and bones. This became a problem due to fire regulations, but Mies made it his goal to have the skeleton as visible as possible despite that. He achieved this by covering concrete shells with steel plates, thus keeping uniformity of the steel columns. One of the most important features of these towers is they are built with prefabricated parts. For example, during the construction of the facade, 4 window units were assembled on the roof and fastened from above from column to column. The same vertical standard T-profile that the window units were made of was fastened to the columns and corner pillars. The structure therefore consists of a system of filling and framework that created a very consistent pattern of contrasting black steel against the glass surface. By making the construction of the building the design priority, Mies created a system that led his perfect grid from structure to window and finally interior partitions. Quote, from outside to inside, from permanent to temporary, the architecture evolved in the sequence of construction, unquote. Another Miesian building, which follows this sort of international style skyscraper motif, is located in New York City. And this is the Seagram building, probably one of his most famous structures in the United States. And it really epitomizes the elegance and principles of modernism. It is a 38-story building. It's located on Park Avenue, and it was Mies's first attempt at a truly tall office building construction. Mies's solution set a standard for the modern skyscraper, and the building became a monumental continuity of bronze and dark glass, and it climbs up 515 feet to the top of the tower, which juxtaposes with the large granite surface of the plaza below. So you'll notice in this image that unlike many of the skyscrapers in New York, Mies pushes the skyscraper back on the lot. Remember, these properties are so expensive that typically developers would not allow that much openness. But in this case, he pushes it to the back of the lot, opens up that plaza, and allows the building to actually be seen from the sidewalk. The detailing of the exterior surface was carefully determined by the desired exterior expression that Mies wanted to achieve. The metal bronze skin that is seen in the facade is non-structural, but is used to express the idea of structural frame that is underneath. So in this way we could say it is not truly authentic expression of structure. Additional vertical elements are also welded to the window panels, not only to stiffen the skin for installation and wind loading, but to aesthetically further enhance the vertical articulation of the building. And you can see that quite nicely in the drawing on the lower left. The Seagram building, with its use of modern materials and setback from the city grid, became a prototype for future office buildings designed by Mies, as well as a model for many buildings erected in its surroundings. This building is still admired today and set an example for an international style skyscraper that began to change the New York skyline. A project that some of you are probably aware of, because it is located in Detroit, is Lafayette Park. It was completed in 1960, and it's an exceptional example of modern urban architecture as well as urban planning. It has 26 buildings by Mies van der Rohe, and his only works in Michigan, and given that there are 26 buildings here, it is actually the largest collections of his buildings in the world. In addition to multi-family housing, there's also a shopping center and other sort of facilities located right within the complex. Lafayette Park offers 3 high-rise apartment buildings, the Lafayette Pavilion and Lafayette Towers, also designed by Mies van der Rohe, and a 3rd high-rise building, 1300 Lafayette East Cooperative, which was designed by Gunnar Burkertz. Each building offers the unadorned glass and steel feel of the Lafayette Park, which Mies van der Rohe cited the civilizing force of technology as the driving and sustaining force of its time. They also have swimming pools and fitness centers. This was meant to be sort of a self-sufficient enclave within the city. You can see here some of the garden apartments. Because Lafayette Park is a short walk from downtown and the Eastern Market, it's also a short bike ride to the Cultural Center downtown and East Riverfront and Belle Isle. This is a very popular place to live. The image on the left shows the garden apartments juxtaposed with some of the high-rise structures. There's plenty of green space. There's also a neighborhood park, and the landscape architecture dresses up the periphery of the neighborhood. In the next few slides, I just want to go quite quickly through some of the other high-rise buildings that were built through the 50s and into the 60s that speak to this type of high-rise aesthetic. And so we've got Mies van der Rohe, there's Lakeshore Drive on the left, and then on the right we have Skidmore, Owings & Merrill's Lever House, which is in New York. You'll notice that this particular building, again, we have the high-rise and the plinth below. This is quite a popular motif, and it was a response to, again, the setback requirements in New York City, that you could not, in fact, fill the entire footprint of the site. You can see the Seagram building on the left, and then on the right we have John Hancock Tower, which is in Boston. You'll notice on the John Hancock Tower that you can see the lateral cross bracing of the structure expressed on the facade. So again, that idea of an engineering aesthetic or skin and bones was one that became extremely popular, and as we can see with the John Hancock Tower, had many different expressions. And there's another view of Lever House, which with a bird's eye, we have a better view into the sort of garden of the terrace there, of the plinth building. And there's another image of it. And you start to get a sense in this image of that streetscape in Manhattan and how the different designers deal with the setback. Moving now from skyscrapers, we're going to look at other large buildings as well, but I want to talk a little bit more about some mid-century modern designers and the work that they did. So Eero Saarinen, as we mentioned before, when we discussed Elio Saarinen and his wife Loija, who worked at Cranbrook, in fact built the Cranbrook Educational Community campuses, well, he's their son. And he was incredibly influential in shaping the American post-war design movement. He was born in Finland, Taloya. She, again, a quick reminder, was a weaver and photographer, and his father, Eliel Saarinen, was an architect. And Eero was sort of primed from the start to take a place among the designers and architects developing and strengthening an environment to change domestic industrial face of the United States. In 1947, both Eliel Saarinen and his son Eero entered the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial Competition in St. Louis, Missouri. The winner was announced as Mr. Saarinen, and the family assumed that this reference was to Eliel. In fact, it was the younger Mr. Saarinen who had actually garnered first prize. This project thrust Eero, who had studied architecture at Yale University, into the orbit of the premier architects of the country. He had entered the competition with over 170 other designers, and the prize money was about $40,000 for first prize, which, as you might imagine, in the 40s was a tremendous amount of money. And, of course, it was one of the most prestigious architectural competitions in the world at this time. In his proposal, Eero Saarinen came up with the idea of building a freestanding arch. He wanted this to be very sculptural. So you can see here the drawing and the shadow cast by the arch, and then below, so we have the plan, and then we also have a more sectional image below. Initially, Saarinen thought that this arch would be made of concrete, and eventually came up with the idea of stainless steel. There are many versions of the arch, and originally it was four-sided, but a sculptor who had worked with Rodin convinced Eero that it ought to be three-sided. So over time, as Eero Saarinen worked through the process, it became a much more elegant and attenuated form, much more sculptural. This particular arch was built to commemorate the western expansion of the United States. That's why it's called the Gateway Arch. And Eero Saarinen wanted it to be kind of a futuristic marker that rose above the cityscape of St. Louis. In its design, the monument drew from previous symbolic constructs of similar aspiration, scale, and mathematical precision. Yet, it is wholly unique. The catenary form, an ideal form that exists largely in compression, was the starting point for Saarinen's design. Sweeping a triangular section of variable sizes along this curve was the basis for its form. The mathematical catenary was then distorted in order to increase aesthetic impact of the design while still maintaining the structural performance. The Gateway Arch preserved this kind of tradition of mathematical rigor and rationality. Ah, yes, very rational. Also, the formal simplicity in the design of American monuments that had begun, say, with the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. At the same time, Saarinen wanted to instill a notion of contemporaneity in the material and programmatic complexity of the program. So here we can see, this is inside. Programmatically, Saarinen wanted his arch to also act as an observation deck. A complex system of elevator cars that climb diagonally to the top of the curved arch carry 12 people at a time to the top, where visitors can view the surrounding landscape from 630 feet above the ground. This image shows one of these elevator car pods, and Saarinen designed them as sort of this futuristic pods that were inspired by the similar aesthetics of the time. In addition to the arch, the project sought to situate itself within the larger park of the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. This plan and project reframed the historic old courthouse as the park's center under the apex of the new Gateway Arch. The pairing of the arch and the courthouse has become iconic of both the city of St. Louis and the greater region. Another project by Eero Saarinen in Michigan, more in Michigan specifically, is the General Motors Technical Center. This is situated on a square mile of lightly wooded countryside, and it's quite an extraordinary assemblage of 20 buildings. It includes a complex of roads, so it's kind of like a small city, a sizable man-made lake with fountains, and also a handsomely modeled stainless steel water tower. This complex has been called a coordinated research town and also an industrial Versailles. It is interesting to note that early in the planning phase, Saarinen was considering large office block, but eventually, given the site, he decided to go with more of a office park. Three overarching themes emerged from a review of these projects that Saarinen produced over an 11-year period of his architectural maturity. And we can see most of these in his General Motors Technical Center. First, Saarinen was committed to the exploration of new building technologies and materials, and he searched constantly for ways to achieve and advance the art of architecture by producing innovative formal solutions that reflect science and chemical discoveries. And by chemical, we can think, say, material science. Secondly, Eero Saarinen treated every architectural commission as a separate artistic problem, and he sought to create an original artistic expression of the functional complexities and cultural meaning of each one. This emphasis on communication, right, what the building communicates, was a huge priority for him, and was equal to the need for formal discipline and quality in design. And because of this emphasis on communication, Saarinen was, delved into popular and commercial imagery with an open-mindedness and enthusiasm that many other sort of quote-unquote elite modern designers did not match. Finally, third, Saarinen clearly imagined his buildings as inhabited and animated spaces, and he therefore focused on circulation, framing, and the central experiences of the clients. He cared deeply about the spiritual and psychological effects of his architecture, and he wanted users of his buildings and furniture to look as good as they felt. In this respect, he seems to be the consummate American modernist, an architect who saw himself as a creator of glamorous, exciting buildings in which contemporary business transactions and the experiences of everyday life would become even more brilliant, more efficient, and more beautiful. For Saarinen at the General Motors Technical Center, he created what he called, quote, a family of forms, unquote, in which each building would be imagined. It must be powerful enough to communicate the identity and meaning of the individual project, because each building, like each program or client, has its own special character. Every commission called for its own distinctive architectural language. Quote, architecture must make a strong emotional impact on man, unquote, Saarinen wrote. I have come to see the conviction that once one embarks on a concept for a building, this concept has to be exaggerated and overstated and repeated in every part of its interior, so that wherever you are, inside or outside, the building sings with the same message, unquote. Known for his dynamic and fluid forms, Saarinen's design for the MIT Chapel takes on a different typology than much of his previous work. Completed in 1955, the MIT Chapel is a simple, cylindrical volume that has a complex and mystical quality. Saarinen's simple design is overshadowed by the interior form and light that were meant to awaken spirituality in the visitor. The non-denominational chapel is intended to be more than just a religious building. It's meant to be a place of solitude and escape that induces a process of reflections. Located at the heart of MIT's campus, The chapel's cylindrical form breaks the rigidity of the campus's orthogonal grid. And you can see on the image on the bottom right, the plan, how very, very simple geometries are used here. And we're going to dive in there and you're going to start to understand some of the way he takes these very simple forms to create something quite wonderful and unique. Tucked away in a small forested area on campus, this windowless chapel sits on as a simple object in the Kresge Oval. As you approach the chapel, you encounter a shallow concrete moat that surrounds the building and appears to seep into the interior around a series of low arches that provide the structure for the chapel. You can see those low arches on the bottom of the brick cylinder in this image. Once inside, the interior expression of this form is quite unexpected, and you wouldn't guess it from the exterior facade. And the interior is inundated with a high level of detail and atmospheric qualities that are enhanced by filtered natural light. So here you can see this is the shallow concrete moat that surrounds the chapel, and you also get a better view of the arches that support the structure. You enter the chapel through what looks almost like a causeway here, that windowed bridge. And when you're in there, you can see this is the stained glasses that filter the view out onto the campus. It's very orthogonal, reflecting sort of the campus as a whole, which is quite rigidly orthogonal. And then inside. Due to the windowless facade, the interior of the chapel is completely masked by the exterior of the volume. Unlike the smooth, uninterrupted facade, the interior brick walls undulate around the circumference of the chapel, which creates a new spatial dynamic that is illuminated by the moat that slips into the interior from the outside. And so what we're seeing here in the left image is how that moat actually comes into the building. And there's the cross section of the moat. You can see how it moves between interior and exterior. It's really when you're inside the chapel that the true architecture takes effect. The dynamic interior transforms into a kind of light box that absorbs and filters the light from the small moat and also a skylight. It's really light that transforms the simple chapel into sort of this constantly changing atmospheric and dematerializing space. There you can see. In addition to the undulating walls, there's one main design feature of the interior of the chapel that was not part of Saarinen's design, but nonetheless creates an impressive atmosphere. Above the white marble altar, there is a metal sculpture by Harry Bertoia that hangs from the skylight that shimmers in the sunlight, and it reflects and distributes light into the interior of the chapel. As you can see on the image on the right, the sculpture appears as a cascading waterfall that is constantly adjusting, moving, and redefining the interior of the chapel. When Saarinen was commissioned to build a TWA terminal in 1956, the client wanted his building to capture the, quote, spirit of flight, unquote. And as visitors rush to make it to their flight, there is no choice but to admire the swooping concrete curves that embrace this kind of jet age of air travel. I should note that the TWA terminal at Kennedy Airport is no longer an airport, it's now a hotel, but this form of the structure remains. In order to capture the concept of flight, Saarinen used curves to create spaces that flowed into one another. The exterior concrete roof imitates a bird in flight with two massive wings. The interior consists of a continuous ribbon of elements, all whisking themselves in from the exterior, so that the ceilings continuously run into walls and those walls become floors. The structure consists of a shell of reinforced concrete with 4 segments that extend outward from the central point. The concrete wings then unfold on either side of the exterior, as though preparing for light. Within the concrete, the structure is reinforced with a web of steel. We can also see, of course, large panels of glass, and these glass walls are tilted at an angle, and this is intended for viewers to imagine looking out from a plane to the earth below. These windows also highlight the purpose of the structure, of course, providing views of departing and arriving planes. So in Eero Saarinen, we have someone working in this contextual, more spiritual way, pushing the limits of what materials can do, interested in the detailed precision of the modern aesthetic, but absolutely willing to take on new materials in new ways and not be bounded by some strict universal rule. And we'll hear mention of Eero again a bit later in this lecture when we're talking about Charles Eames. In the next few slides, sadly we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on this in the lecture, we're going to look at the Case Study House program. This spawned from a post-World War II residential experiment. It was presented by the Arts and Architecture magazine in 1945 and introduced modern movement ideas for affordable and efficient housing during the post-war years. What we're going to see in the next few examples are designs by people like Richard Neutra, Charles and Ray Eames, Pierre Koenig, Eero Saarinen, and others. And these are ideas that they presented in these case study houses, redefined the modern house, and placed in particular Los Angeles as an epicenter for mid-century modernism. And just very quickly, this is John Entenza, and he was the one that launched this program. And the program was really an outgrowth of endless discussions in the editorial offices of Arts and Architecture, where during World War II, John Entenza and a number of relatively young architectural guns would talk about new ideas in residential design and construction. Of course, they could only talk about them because of wartime restrictions in building. Among these people having the discussions were Ralph Rapson, John Rex, Richard Neutra, Charles Eames, Whitney Smith, and Thornton Abel. And there were others, of course. The program announcement stated the following: each house must be capable of duplication and in no sense be an individual performance. It is important that the best materials available be used in the best possible way in order to arrive at a good solution for each problem, which in the overall program will be general enough to be of practical assistance to the average American in search of a home in which he can afford to live. It's important to note right away that several of the case study houses were built high in the hills of Bel Air and Brentwood and were certainly beyond the means of the average individual. However, the intention and purpose of the program was to provide housing ideas after World War II. The announcement goes on, quote, "We of course assume that the shape and form of post-war living is of primary importance to a great many Americans, and that the houses will be conceived within the spirit of our times, using, as far as is practical, many war-born techniques and materials best suited to the expression of man's life in the modern world." Now, when the Case Study House program was announced in January of 1945, contributors had high hopes that the homes would begin construction almost immediately. Unfortunately, It would take many years for the first homes to be built. However, that did not stop Arts and Architecture magazine from publishing the first plans, drawings, and models of Case Study House Number 1 a few months later. Unfortunately, this original Number 1 would never be built, and would be replaced instead by a new design by the same architect, J.R. Davidson, in 1948. Case Study House Number 1 was the first of 11 case study homes that were drawn up and published in Art and Architecture but never built. Here's a look at a few unbuilt and built masterpieces. So this is Case Study Number 1, unbuilt, designed by J.R. Davidson for a family of 3. It is a unique 2-bedroom floor plan with additional quarters built on for guests. Davidson's idea was to build a home that would be convenient for the new phenomenon in mid-century America, a family with 2 working parents. Here you can see other images and the model. So each of these projects was developed through a series of drawings and also models for selection. Another project unbuilt is Case Study House Number 4 by Ralph Rapson. This was published in September of 1945. According to the article that accompanied it, the house was set to begin construction the following February, but it never came to be. This may be due to post-war constraints, such as the limited availability of building materials, or it could also have been the lack of interested client buyers. Rapson's key idea in his project was to emphasize an integration of outdoor and indoor environments, with a garden tract that cut right through the middle of the house. Interestingly, Ralph Rapson was one of only 2 architects from outside of California to be tapped to design a case study house. This project, Number 4, was as boldly modern as any of the California designs and built studies. Unlike some of the other projects, Case Study Number 4 was designed for a more urban lot and has therefore a more introverted design. It focuses its attention on an interior courtyard space instead of outwards to the great landscaper view. The home is made of 2 pavilions, one for sleeping and one for living, bisected by a glass-covered courtyard. Rapson named this central space the Greenbelt. The design was to have either a wood or steel frame and standardized wall panels. As you can see in some of these images, Rapson was known for adding such whimsical touches as jeeps, commuter helicopters, and characterized people to add life to his architectural renderings. Case Study Houses Number 6 and Number 13, dubbed Alpha and Omega by their designer Richard Neutra, were actually intended to be built side by side to create a close relationship between neighbors. This was to be achieved by combining the yard and recreational outdoor areas so that 2 families would potentially live in close proximity to each other while also maintaining privacy at the same time. While Neutra's vision of sister houses was never realized, it is rumored that one of his later designs, the Gordon Wilkins House, is a carbon copy of the plans for the Case Study House Number 13. The Gordon Wilkins House was built in South Pasadena in 1949. Now a couple of projects that were built. This is Case Study House Number 9, the Entenza House in Pacific Palisades. This project was designed by Charles Eames and Eero Saarinen. It was completed in 1949. As you can see even here in this one snapshot, the house is modular in plan and features steel frame construction. In contrast to many modern residences utilizing steel frame construction, you don't see all of the structure in the Entenza house. It's not really revealed. It's actually concealed in most places with wood-paneled cladding. The room arrangement included 2 bedrooms, a study, 2 bathrooms, kitchen, large open living dining area, utility room, and garage. A large sunken living room with a built-in seating area was meant to encourage conversation. Since John Entenza frequently entertained, the house consists of mostly public, and very little private space. Now remember, the case study houses were supposed to promote the most advanced technologies and materials. So case study house number 9 is sheathed in Truscan Faro board with the ocean-facing elevation glazed by Libby Owens Ford glass with Truscan steel window framing. The east elevation consists of lightweight concrete block by Rocklight. This design exemplifies the concept of merging interior and exterior spaces through glass expanses and seamless materials. The Case Study House program produced some of the most iconic architectural projects of the 20th century, but none are more iconic or as famous as the Stahl House, also known as Case Study House number 22 by Pierre Koenig. The modern residence overlooks Los Angeles from the Hollywood Hills. It was completed in 1959 for Buck Stahl and his family. Buck Stahl had envisioned a modernist glass and steel constructed house that offered panoramic feels of Los Angeles. And here you can see the view. Here are some of the drawings. Pierre Koenig was able to hone in on the vision of Buck Stahl's plans and transform that vision into a modernist icon. The glass and steel construction is understandably the most identifiable trait of architectural modernism, but it is the way in which Koenig organized the spatial layout of the house, taking the private and public aspects into great consideration, that makes this building, this home, truly unique. As much as architectural modernism is associated with the materials and methods of construction, the juxtaposition of program and organization are important design principles that evoke utilitarian and functionalist characteristics. The house is L-shaped, and the private and public sectors are completely separated except for a single hallway that connects the two wings. Compositionally adjacent is the swimming pool that one must cross in order to get into the house. It is not only a spatial division of public and private, but it serves as an interstitial space that one must pass through in order to experience the panoramic views. The living space of the house is set back behind the pool and is the only part of the house that has a solid wall, which backs up to the carport and the street. The entire house is understood to be one large viewing box that captures amazing perspectives of the house, the landscape, and Los Angeles. It is very strange to imagine that the Stahl House was unknown and unrecognized for some time, until in 1960, when Julius Schulman captured the pure architectural essence of the house with his photography. It was one image in particular, a night shot of two women sitting in the living room overlooking the bright lights of the city of LA. That photo put the Stahl House on the architectural radar as being an architectural gem hidden up in the Hollywood Hills. Now we're going to spend a few minutes talking about Charles and Ray Eames, absolutely fundamental figures in mid-century modernism. Charles and Ray Eames headed one of the most creative design offices in post-World War II America. They're frequently photographed in matching clothes, poses, or both, and they brought a rich array of talents to their partnership. They saw their life and their home as a kind of laboratory. They had a laboratory workshop and office in LA, and they worked constantly on making and creating things. This came from some of the most iconic furniture of the 20th century to architecture, interiors, films, multimedia shows, and exhibitions. And we can really think of them as tastemakers. They helped shape how people thought about objects and buildings. A little bit about both of them. So Rey studied art in the 1930s with Hans Hofmann, the famous German émigré painter and teacher, and she became an accomplished painter and sculptor with a very strong sense of structure and color. Together with fellow Hofmann students, Rey joined the American Abstract Artists, a militant organization that picketed galleries refusing to show non-representational art. Rey was part of this art movement that fed into American abstract expressionism, a movement that in the 1950s came to dominate the international art world. It is no coincidence that the Eames' most exciting and popular furniture designs were created in that decade, and owe much to Rey's close familiarity with modern art. Charles' route to modernism was a bit more varied. Despite his high practical and engineering skills and an outstanding talent for problem solving, he was asked to leave his Beaux-Arts oriented architecture course in 1927, after only 2 years, because he had demanded a greater focus on modern work, particularly that of Frank Lloyd Wright, and he wished to design a more modern way. He visited Europe, and the European modernists made a great impression on Charles. But when he returned to the U.S. at the dawn of the Depression, Charles and his architectural partners took what work they could, and he did many designs in Colonial Revival, Art Deco, and other styles of homes. A bit later on, Charles was invited to Cranbrook, where he planned to spend his year-long fellowship reading and refocusing, but instead, he headed up the new design department. His time at Cranbrook deepened Charles's respect for humanistic approach to design, as well as for modernism, and a focus on not only the zeitgeist, so that spirit of the age, but also Gesamtkunstwerk, the idea of total work of art. In collaboration with Eero Saarinen, Charles began exploring the possibilities of new materials and techniques, particularly molded plywood. The molded plywood furniture that Eames and Saarinen designed for a 1940s competition organized by the Museum of Modern Art to encourage American furniture designers brought them considerable attention. The technologies proved inadequate, but fortunately war intervened before this became well known. Charles also met Rey at Cranbrook, and when they married, they moved to LA to focus on the mass manufacturing of low-cost molded plywood furniture, getting what Charles called, quote, the most of the best to the most for the least, unquote. Rey's stunning graphics and textiles of the early and mid-1940s indicate a strong independent design talent, but she chose, as did many women of her generation, to work jointly on a project that she did not originate. By 1951, they had seen through to commercially viable mass production, low-cost furniture in plastic and metal, as well as plywood. They were the first to do this successfully. Charles and Rey also designed one of the case study houses, originally known as Case Study House No. 8, but most fondly known as the Eames House. This is a spatially pleasant modern residence, and it was where the architects lived themselves. They began designing the house in 1945 for the Case Study House program, and then later moved into it. The intention was for the house to be made of prefabricated materials that would not interrupt the site, that it would be easy to be built, and that it would exhibit a modern style. The house is situated on a 3-acre site on top of a 150-foot cliff that overlooks the Pacific Ocean. The site is a flat parcel on otherwise steep land that creates a retaining wall to the west. The response to this condition was a concrete retaining wall that ties together 2 boxes, separated by a courtyard. This is the partie of the residence. So one of the boxes is the home, residential area, and the other is their workshop laboratory. so both the residence and the studio, provide double height spaces at the corners and outer ends of both programs. This allows for a composition that breaks the space up rhythmically and is read on the exterior of the house, with the exterior courtyard serving as a double height space in between both boxes. Along with the retaining concrete wall, a simple steel frame was used for the structure. The steel frame uses 4-inch H-columns for the walls and 12-inch deep web joists for the roof. The steel frame was filled in with different solid and transparent colored panels arranged to create a shifting light in the interior throughout the day. The importance given to light in the design can be connected to Japanese influence. This attention to detail, however, did not hinder the aspect of displaying the idea of prefabrication. The house was built largely of standard components, such as the windows, which measured a standard width of 3 feet 4 inches. Contrasting to the cold steel framing that forms the structure, the interior of the house is warm and comfortable, with its wood block floor and the soft light penetrating into each room through the day. Wooden staircases float effortlessly, connecting the lower and upper levels. The use of natural materials on the interior brings the residence closer to nature, giving the appearance of the house resting softly on the earth. A row of eucalyptus trees was also planted at the front that provides shade and blends parts of the house with the outdoors. Now, the final designer that we will look at today is Louis I. Kahn. Louis Kahn. And he was an immigrant, so again, this is another example of émigré designer. He was Estonian born, and he's kind of a hard fit. He doesn't fit very well into that mid-century modern category. He does not fit very well into international style either. Yet his work was hugely influential and is an important piece, an additional piece of the quite complex puzzle of architecture after World War II. Now, Kahn had a steadfast belief that all materials had their own destiny, and he wouldn't tolerate any attempt to deviate from that. During the age of clean modernism and the use of cutting-edge materials, his architecture was often dismissed for being overly symbolic and heavily venerating buildings of the past. Kahn's buildings often took the form of cavernous brick shells with large geometric cutouts, which he would describe them as sort of ruins in reverse. We'll look at a few examples now. The first is the Richards Medical Building at the University of Pennsylvania. This was built in the late 50s into the 60s. The Richards labs are composed of a group of connected vertical volumes whose interior functions are expressed by differing external treatments. The laboratories are marked by corner windows and supported and separated by cantilevered structures. The structure is made of precast concrete beams and horizontal bands of brick veneer. The mechanical and circulation functions of the buildings are contained in tall brick-faced towers rising above the laboratory sections. And so here I think you can see this a little better. And you can see the clear emphasis on functional and structural expression. You can see the towers for circulation. You can also see that network of precast concrete, the sort of grid, into which the different pods of the labs would be placed. So it's very modular, focused on prefabrication, and also function, so very functionally oriented. Now, another very compelling building that I hope you all know already is the Salk Institute for Biological Sciences. This is in California, and here we see very clearly how he's moved beyond the international style. So Kahn believed that buildings should be monumental and spiritually inspiring. And here at the Salk Institute, he is successful in creating the formal perfection and emotional expression that he wants to achieve. Now, just a side note, Salk was the inventor of the polio vaccine, and Kahn was actually invited by Dr. Jonas Salk to design this institute. And Salk's vision was to have a facility with an inspiring environment for scientific research. And Kahn's design decision creates a functional institutional building that is also an architectural masterpiece. The open plaza that we see here is made of travertine marble, and a single narrow strip of water runs down the center, which sort of links the plaza to the Pacific Ocean. It also draws the eye along the line out to the horizon. Now looking back the other way, so let's go back, you can see it's very, very spare. You can see the concrete, you can see the formwork of the concrete. It's quite rough and it's almost solid. But looking from the ocean side, looking backwards, you can see all those openings of the different laboratory spaces. Before designing the building, Kahn studied monasteries in order to build his concept of this intellectual retreat. And he took advantage of course, the position of the site here with the ocean and sort of the tranquil surroundings with abundant natural light. His overall partie here is to have a symmetrical plan with two structures that mirror each other across this open plaza. The buildings each have 6 stories. The first 3 contain laboratories and the last 3 have utilities. The materials that make up the Salk Institute consist of concrete, teak, lead, glass, and steel. And interestingly, and again this has to do with technology but also linking it with history, the concrete was poured using a technique that Kahn had studied in Roman architecture. And this was that once the concrete was set, there's no additional finishing touches. He wanted to maintain that sort of warm glow and processed look of the concrete. Another Kahn building that reminds us of his fixation on geometry is the library at Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire. Now, in the brief for this project, the committee said, quote, "A reader, as he enters the library, must be able to sense at once the building's plan," unquote. So they're very concerned with wayfinding for students at this academy. Kahn admirably accomplishes this charge. Entering from the main entrances on the ground floor, which are at the corners, you climb a set of stairs to the first floor, and the visitor can immediately perceive the relationship of reference area, circulation desk, and book stacks. One of the most compelling things to me about this project is the uniformity and consistency of the mathematical system. So as you can see on the image on the right, there are built-in carrels at the windows. So the unit of the window is based on the human body and that carrel specifically. And that is carried throughout the building. Very, very rigorous. Here you can see some of those Platonic forms, the use of concrete again and wood for warmth, but the cross bracing, the grid, the circle, a huge focus of Kahn on the idea of mathematics. And the final project is the Kimball Art Museum. I'm showing this to you, we could spend several lectures looking at this one project, but just to look at how he uses geometry again. So the main facade of the building consists of 3 100-foot bays, and each of these bays is fronted by an open barrel-vaulted portico with the central entrance bay recessed and glazed. We can see in the side view how those barrel vaults move consistently. They are the organizing partie of the building. The buildings suggest the grand arches and vaults of Roman architecture, a source of inspiration that Kahn himself acknowledged. In keeping with this Roman tone, the principal materials are concrete, travertine marble, and white oak. And here's a peek inside. Kahn designed a building with light as a primary theme. In addition to artificial light, natural light enters through narrow plexiglass skylights. These skylights run across the top of a cycloid barrel vault. So the barrel vault's actually split to allow light to come in onto these baffles and then wash down over these concrete vaults. And here you can see the cross section. You'll notice that the landscaping continues, the planting of the trees continues the same bay articulation that Kahn uses in the building. So you have that, the alleys of trees continuing the layering structure of the outdoor spaces. Again, here the detailing of that geometry. So what we see in Kahn is quite different from how the lecture started in looking at those international style skyscrapers. And it's a reminder that in this middle period, mid-century modernism, while it may have had particular faces, from the case study houses to the Eames to Eero Saarinen, that there are also figures like Kahn working through the late 50s through to the 70s who are making original and wonderfully rich buildings.